Resident Evil Requiem is probably the most intriguing entry in the series so far, not just because I'm a massive Resident Evil fanboy, but for what it represents while being the 9th entry in a 30-year-long series. I think the reason I came to this conclusion is because for at least a while now, Resident Evil hasn't really felt that whole to me. And what I mean by that is this. Back in 2017, when I was just a little jit, I played Resident Evil 7 Biohazard for the first time. And it genuinely scarred the hell out of me because I was like 8 or 9. But not only did it scare me for various reasons, but it also completely flipped my perspective on what horror games could be. That was my introduction into Resident Evil that led me into Village, into the remakes with Leon. This channel probably wouldn't even exist without Resident Evil, since I base a lot of my content on scary games. So yeah, if you couldn't tell, Resident Evil means a lot to me. But while RE7 was an amazing experience for little Jit Noah, that introduction came with a hidden cost. Because starting with Biohazard, especially in hindsight, meant I experienced Resident Evil through one very specific and different lens. A slower, more grounded, survival horror focused lens. And over time I realized that didn't fully line up with the rest of the series. Games like Resident Evil Village pulled me in, but in my opinion, I feel like the faster, more action-heavy packed games like in the style of Resident Evil 4, for example, always felt just a little bit disconnected to me. Not to say I didn't enjoy them, because I still enjoyed those games a hell of a lot, but if you gave me the choice between something like Biohazard and RE4, I'm picking Biohazard every time because that's what feels more familiar and more like Resident Evil to me. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels that way for those who started off with RE7, because for years now, since 2017 to be in fact, I feel Resident Evil has been split between these two varying concepts of Resident Evil. And that's exactly why Resident Evil Requiem is so interesting to me. Also, let's take the time to really admire this play button that my buddy Ben made. Everyone say I love you, Ben, in the chat down below. Resident Evil 9 ended up sealing a division I've had with this series for quite some time. I mentioned earlier that I sided with RE7 because to me that's what felt the most Resident Evil-y. But truthfully, what does that even mean? I only came to that conclusion because RE7 was my first real experience with the series, but what if someone else started with something like Resident Evil 6 or the more cultish action-heavy style of Resident Evil 4? The truth is, any of these games could feel like the definition of Resident Evil, and it all depends on what you experienced first. That's the hidden cost of having a series that changes so drastically from entry to entry, but at the same time, it's also one of its biggest strengths. Identity. Identity plays a huge role in Resident Evil because identity dictates a lot of what happens in each entry. The atmosphere here in Mother Earth, the horror, and the gameplay. Identity allows each entry in this bizarre series to create something uniquely different every single time. And because of that, this allows the series to constantly shift between two different avenues, action horror and psychological horror, while essentially dividing the players on which versions of Resident Evil they connect with more. And I for one realized that's exactly what happened to me. It made me feel like a lot of the other entries, especially the more action heavy ones, were just a little bit disconnected from what I personally wanted out of the series. And while I recognize that many people might not agree with this and actually like both styles equally, I cannot undermine that for a while now I've been feeling that divide. Until Resident Evil Requiem. Yeah, I mean, if you couldn't tell, I have a lot to say about Requiem. And I think the best way to start things off is simply by just talking my ass off on why this game is so goddamn good. I think it's no secret that Requiem was a response to my problem with division in this series. With the success of this game and it selling like 5 million copies in the first 5 days, I'm pretty sure, it's safe to assume that not only was that problem present of division, but that they fixed it, right? Yeah, I mean, if I were to say so myself, I think they definitely fixed that division. Not only through the concept of switching between Leon and Grace, but I think that's also amplified by the fact that we return to Raccoon City. It almost feels like the game is going through this rebirth by going back to the roots of this series while simultaneously holding a candle to what revived the series when sales were down. I think it's all pretty well done, and honestly just a really cool way to dive into the two very distinct styles of Resident Evil. Basically what I'm trying to say is that RE9 satisfies both parts of my Resident Evil brain. It gives me that psychological horror fix while at the same time giving me that action horror fix of the remakes. And not only does that create a unique and intriguing gaming experience, but it also makes returning to the remakes and older entries feel less disconnected when compared to its modern counterparts. And while there are some very obvious caveats that come with this, which I will be definitely getting into later in this video, I think the core concept is done well enough to accomplish what it was setting out to do. And I think in order to fully appreciate what it accomplishes, I think it's pretty important to talk about my individual experience with this game that led me to this conclusion. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the core fundamentals of RE9. The characters, the story, and the gameplay. While the game doesn't introduce an entirely new set of characters like RE7 and Village, and does bring back a considerable amount of older characters, I find that they're still interesting, if not more interesting than a cast of brand new characters. I find this is the case because, one, Leon Kennedy is returning and we all love him, but two, RE9's writing is clever and interesting enough to make these returning characters feel substantial, and not, for a lack of better term, nostalgia bait. While I do enjoy the new characters like Grace and Victor, it's pretty obvious that with the return of Leon and Raccoon City, there is really gonna be this overarching theme of nostalgia. And while it's present, definitely, it feels tasteful and thoughtfully implemented, and doesn't make me want to jump into this here creek. I find that with a lot of long-running series, whether that's story games or just video games entirely, nostalgia is constantly brought in to usher in more players, even if it negatively impacts the story or game. And while RE9 does utilize some nostalgia for certain parts, it actually feels like it's there to enhance the experience. One thing that it directly enhances is the story, which I will get into right now. The story in RE9, while being great in my opinion, is definitely a step in a different direction, and you can chalk this up to the influence of past entries or the flip-flopping between two different perspectives, but I think the main reason why RE9's story is so different is just the simple fact that it's not as straightforward as the last two entries. And look, while I was able to get through the story completely fine, I could see maybe, a couple journalists not understanding what's actually happening. That was a joke rated mediocre by IGN themselves. All I'm really trying to say is that in order to fully understand and appreciate what's going on in Requiem, it can't be approached in the same way RE7 was approached when it first came out, and directly requires some understanding of the series beforehand. I'm not talking like understanding of deep lore, like, how many individual hairs Leon has on his body.
Oh, this chiseled. What the is this a guardian or something? Must be a guardian angel or some shit.
I'm talking maybe you actually need to play some of the remakes in order to play this. With all that being said, I really dug RE9's story from start to finish. It was really interesting and it really reminded me of a game I also really love, and that game was Alan Wake 2. Side note, does RE9 not feel like it takes a lot of inspiration from Alan Wake 2? I'm not saying Alan Wake 2, invented any of these things, but I mean, come on, the two different protagonists, one being the rookie, one being the seasoned veteran, colliding in a interconnected story to take down this big bad person that's been going on for a while. I don't know. Seems kind of like an Alan Wake 2 reheated nachos kind of thing. No hate though, I still love it.
I'll check out that map.
RE9's story, as mentioned before, isn't as simple or straightforward as the other entries in the series, but I much prefer it. I enjoyed Leon and Grace's arcs as characters, I love the twists and turns that it brought, and overall, there isn't really that much to say other than it having a fantastic and engaging narrative. I mentioned in one of my 18 videos that I am a story gamer, or something along the lines of that. I'm not 100% sure. I'm mostly looking for that narrative to satisfy me as a player, and afterwards, I don't really have that much of a drive to replay it once I had, experienced the story. And while that's wholeheartedly true and something that I've experienced numerous times, as soon as I beat this game, I quit to the main menu and immediately started a new playthrough. And while half of the reason was for the really well crafted and enjoyable narrative, the other half was from the game's biggest strength, while at the same damn time, biggest weakness. gameplay. I'll elaborate on this right now, so please do not click off the video. I genuinely think Resident Evil Requiem carries some of the most fun gameplay Resident Evil has had in years. As I stated numerous times, it gives those slower, tense survival horror moments that I love, but then it can instantly, boom, switch into faster, more action-heavy sequences. And that's the whole point, right? It's the, as mentioned before, balance of these two different styles of RE. Viewing both Grace and Leon as separate experiences that aren't combined demonstrate that they both carry the best combat the series has ever had thus far. It's really engaging, and when playing as Leon, actually addicting. And during some of the stylish kills, it made me jump out of my chair from being hyped like I was Super Hot Fire himself. It's half of the reason I started a second playthrough of this game directly after beating it, something I barely do for any game, point blank period. I think Grace's style of gameplay is the best it's ever been for that RE7 style, and I think the same goes for Leon. I think the upgrade system, while being a core fundamental mechanic in all RE games, is at its best here, and to put it simply, everything is just sublime when viewing both separately. Yeah, as a conjoined experience that flip-flop between these two vastly different styles, it does have the potential to work, but let me ask you this. What looks more engaging to play? Or this? Playing through this game reminded me of finishing Village. In Village, you start off as this weak little man that can barely kill a single enemy, then near the end, you can gun down multiple of those same enemies that you were struggling with at the start. Not only was this a simple payoff for the time you spent playing this game, but it created an obvious sense of forward momentum along with just establishing the pacing. So when you take this to RE9, where you're going from a weak protagonist to someone doing tomahawk, backflip, roundhouse 360 headshots with the fucking motorcycle, then back to the weak protagonist, there's no real sense of forward progression other than the story. And in fact, it actually feels like the pacing is being halted at some points because you're constantly flip-flopping between the two. And while I think that the idea is genius, the execution is just a bit too jarring at some points. As much as I enjoy Grace's style of gameplay and the overall psychological horror and survival aspect of this game, you can't expect me to want to go back to literal suffering and slow stealth sections once I'm doing super stimulating zombie murdering combos. Maybe it's just a problem within my brain. I don't know. I understand the idea of the styles constantly changing because that's how the story is designed to keep you engaged. You play as Grace, make it to a cliffhanger, then you're Leon, and getting back to said cliffhanger becomes your new motivator. I understand that. But in the end, in my opinion, all it really feels like is that it undermines both styles. I remember thinking while first playing it, like at the very start, like, wow, this is really cool. But nearing the end of the game when Leon was like about to die, I started to think, maybe switching to Grace for, a stealth section where you battle these freaking weird looking monsters. I don't know, it became a little bit tedious to me. So with that being said, I bet you're probably wondering, wait a second, I thought you said Requiem sealed that divide you had with these series. Well, I did say that. And to be honest, I think it still does no matter what. Is it the most eloquent? No, in my opinion, it isn't the most eloquent, but it's still a quality video game. And at the end of the day, my criticisms are just my opinions. I've seen across Twitter and various other social media outlets that many people have seemed to really enjoy this game. And in that sense, RE9 did its job to unify both of these two very different styles into its own whole Resident Evil experience. I find that the issues I have while being present in the game, in the grand scheme of things, isn't as big of a deal as it seems, because other than that, there's really nothing else to fault this game on because most of it is constantly excellent. And in the end, with everything combined and my personal issues, what it does for the series, whether that's sales-wise or popularity-wise or narrative-wise, or just the fact that it unifies what used to divide the series, I think that's pretty incredible, and at this time, incredibly underappreciated. So after discussing the divide within the series and how Resident Evil Requiem attempts to resolve it, I think the most important question that should be taken away from this video is, what does this actually mean for Resident Evil going forward? Because while it's easy to look at Requiem as just another really great entry into a really great series, I think it kind of undersells what RE9 represents. For the better part of a decade, Resident Evil has felt like a series caught between two different identities. On one hand, you have an identity that redefined what the series could be at a time when it needed it most. On the other hand, you have the more action-oriented design philosophy popularized by the remakes, a style that, while, different, is just as important to the DNA of the franchise. And honestly, for years, it's been feeling like Resident Evil has been flip-flopping between these two different styles of play, never fully settling on what it actually wants to be. What Requiem does differently is that it tries to stop being two different things at once, and instead attempts to reconcile those two different things into something that can exist at the same time. Now, whether or not it does that perfectly is, up to you, because from a personal standpoint, that balance does come with its own, set of issues. But even with those flaws in mind, Requiem still accomplishes great things, because for the first time, Resident Evil doesn't feel divided anymore. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it feels more interconnected than ever. And I think that distinction matters, because instead of isolating different types of players who prefer those two different gameplay styles, it instead creates a space where both can exist within the same experience. And for someone like me, someone whose entire perspective on the series was shaped by starting with RE7, Biohazard, that shift is incredibly noticeable, and also just really important to me, because it's the first time where I've played a Resident Evil game and didn't feel that divide. And honestly, I think that's what makes Requiem more than a great game for me, because to me, it marks a turning point. Not because, it's perfect or, flawless or 10 out of 10 on IGN or whatever, but because it proves that Resident Evil doesn't need to be defined by one or maybe two identities. It can evolve beyond that. And if this is the direction the series continues to take, then I think Resident Evil is in a stronger position than it has been in years. And I also just think we're in for a real treat, because at the end of the day, Requiem doesn't just fix an identity crisis. It reframes what Resident Evil actually is. Thank you so much for watching my video. I'm very sorry it took a long time. Resident Evil is my jam and I love this game and it means so much to me. I wanted to make sure I did it right. If you like what you see, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and leaving a really positive comment or hate comment or harassment comment in the chat down below. I really do, and I cannot stress this enough, I really do appreciate your guys' support. Oh my lord. Be good people, continue to be doing amazing things, and I hope you all stay blessed in this time of spring and snow melting and puddles and getting your fresh pants dirty. But much love, you guys. Peace out.